Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. As I do in all my videos, I leave links down in the video description that allow you to jump from one section to another so you can skip ahead or return to a previous section. So this week I have a few tidbits to share. I want to talk about this particular book that several of you asked me to review back in January. I'll give you an update on my Roaring 20s sweater as well as a brand new project that I'm working on as well. So let's get started. So how's everyone doing? It's been quite a week. Events have been canceled right and left. I was anticipating that a hand spinning conference I was going to go to in April would get canceled, and it did. And I was anticipating that a retreat in Wisconsin I was asked to teach at the end of April would be canceled, and it has been. So that's a lot going on, and things, changing pretty quickly. I spend most of my day knitting or thinking about or talking about knitting related things. It's my go-to when I want to be intellectually stimulated. It's my go-to when I want to do something mindless. It's my go-to when I'm anxious or I'm bored or anything. If I'm having something like that, I knit, and it calms me, it gives me patience, and I can just wait everything out, and it's fine. But I was struggling with that early in the week. And a friend of mine, I'm in an online group of writers, and one of them, and a number of us are knitters or crocheters. And one of my friends posted about a story that she had heard on NPR, National Public Radio. And the story was 3 pop culture recommendations to calm your nerves. So I'm going to leave a link down in the description to that story. But the one that really spoke to me was one called Slow TV. And that was the one my friend was sort of bringing up. And that is, some of you may have seen this on Netflix a few years ago. There was this Norwegian television show called National Knitting Night, something like that. And this group of 8 people were trying to break the world record for back-to-back contest, which is from the sheep's back to the knitter's back, meaning they have somebody shearing. It's like the sheep to shawl contest that they have for weavers, but this is for knitters. So they have somebody who hand shears, not with the mechanical shears, but with hand shears the sheep. They are not allowed to card the fiber. They have to spin it directly from there, and then after a certain number of minutes, they have enough yarn or enough that they've spun that they can then ply it into a 2-ply yarn, and then the first knitter can cast on for the back of the sweater. So it's an international competition that teams from different countries do and have been doing since, I think, 1994, 1995, something like that. So this was one of these Norwegian TV, slow TV ideas. Like they have another one where they are just on a train for the entire route of the train. Like 8, 10, 12 hours, 24 hours, something like that. And the idea is that it's just calming. And so I thought, well, that's a good idea. I remember watching some of it on Netflix a few years ago, and I never stuck with it. And I think the reason is because what was on Netflix was in the original Norwegian. So everybody had a little microphone, and they had a host. They had a host who was going around talking to the different people at different points of time, and it was subtitled in English. But when I'm watching TV, I'm usually knitting. So I'm usually spending more of my time looking down. And if something has subtitles, then I'm not knitting. And so I never watched the whole thing. I thought, oh, what a great idea. Well, it's not on Netflix anymore, but it is on the TV channel's website, and it's in the original broadcast version. And that has the host or the sort of the presenter or whatever going around talking to people, but then they'll mute it. Sometimes you can hear them talking, but then they start muting it, and you hear somebody who is just sort of spontaneously translating it at the time. And so in that case, you don't have to be looking at it, but you can hear the sounds of the spinning wheels, and it's a very kind of rhythmic, soothing sound. And so I had it on my TV instead of watching it on my computer. I had it on the TV in the living room, and I was sitting on my couch, and I just felt calmer. Couldn't go to knitting group this week. I couldn't go to my knitting group on Wednesday. Couldn't go on Saturday. The guild meeting was canceled Tuesday. So there's nobody's going out. Nobody's doing anything, and it just felt like I was with other knitters, kind of acting the way we normally would be, all just kind of working on our thing, and it would just be a calm atmosphere. There's many, many hours of this. So I've been doing it a couple of hours at a time, just sitting there on the couch with this going on, and I've been finding it very calming. So I would love to know what you guys are doing as you're knitting and keeping calm, because a lot of the things that I would normally watch are not things I'm wanting to watch. So, and that's kind of what they were talking about in this NPR program about things that just calm you down. And some of the things they were talking about were certain types of video games that are single player video games where you're just building your farm and your village, and you're doing all that kind of thing. So that was one calming thing. Somebody else was watching old seasons of America's Top Model. She found that soothing. So I'd be really interested to know if you could leave down in the comments the kinds of things that you are watching that is helping you, because I was really surprised that I kind of got stuck in my knitting. And part of the reason I got stuck, I realized the downside of Finish It February is that if you have finished all of your projects and you only have your current one and you get stuck on it, if I have nothing else to turn to, like that I just know and I'm familiar with, then I didn't have anything in mind that I wanted to knit. That was kind of like, So I just ordered this kit from Jameson and Smith in the Shetland Islands. And I'd ordered it from them because I wanted just some Shetland wool. I had intended to only order a couple of bottles of wool. But they had these kits for this hat project. So I sat down in front of the TV and I just started this hat project. And I kind of don't care. I did a little bit of swatching ahead of time. I kind of don't care if it fits. I just want to knit my way through it. So I'm going to be talking about that project a little bit later. I'm going to talk about what I got stuck with in my Roaring 20s project. But first, I want to talk about this book, Distitch. I mentioned that a couple of you, I think at least two, if not three people asked me if I would review this book. And so I did. I asked the librarian to order. It came in. It's been sitting on my desk for a few weeks. I did look through it briefly when I first got it, and I thought, oh, this is going to take some time to sit down and actually go through. And so it's just been sitting there. What happened earlier this week when I wasn't knitting and was instead of kind of floundering around is I was spending too much time on social media, which wasn't helping me. And I went over to Facebook. I don't go on Facebook much anymore. I find that it's mostly just a meme sharing website, and which isn't of interest to me. But a month or so ago, when I was talking about that shirt that Charles I wore to his execution, and that it was going to be on exhibition this coming fall, I was complaining that there weren't any photos of it that were close enough that you could really see the stitches and really see what was going on. And I was thinking looks like it was probably really fine gauge, and it was probably somewhere between 50 and 20 stitches per inch, based on a glove that I had seen a couple of years ago that was knit like 500 years ago and was like 20 stitches per inch. it doesn't hardly even look like knitting when you have it like a foot or so away from your face, because the stitches are so fine. So somebody had said in the comments that this group on Facebook, that's a historic knitting group, had been talking about that shirt, and that I had guessed correctly about what the gauge was, and she left a link to the historic group. Well, so I followed it, and it's a private group, so you have to ask to join. So I asked to join, and it took like a day or so, and I came back and I saw that not only had they been discussing Charles I's shirt, that there's a woman in this group who, like, some of these people are actual like historians and have had access to this shirt up close, and they didn't look at it when it was on display. Like, they were shown the item in the box, allowed to look at it, allowed to photograph it, and she posted these really close-up photographs of the knitting, and I was like, that is amazing. So I thought, well, this is a really interesting group. There's not like tons and tons of posts every day. There's just every few days, once a week, something like that, somebody posts something really interesting, a little bit of discussion about it. And so it's something where you can actually learn, and there's some real experts on there, which is, I find, to be a rare thing in a lot of these Facebook groups. So on Monday or Tuesday, when I was kind of floundering around and looking on Twitter and whatever, I went over to Facebook, and I thought, I'm just going to look at the historic knitting group, see if anything's happening. And then I just decided to look in the past few months to see what they'd posted about, because it wasn't, like I said, there's not just tons and tons of things that are overwhelming. And what I saw was that one of the women had posted a link to the website for this book. And she said, this woman has invented, what did she call it? 2-course simple knit, only she came up with a better name for it. And I said, and in my head, I was thinking that term 2-course, like, sort of sounded familiar, but I was Googling around, I couldn't find anything. And I said, could you explain what you mean by that? And so 2 people very quickly sent me information. One was a link, which I'm going to leave down below, to a website that the the information was posted in 2015. So it was 3 years after this woman kind of created this technique. But what it's discussing is that the oldest extant pieces of actual knitting, not something that people thought was knitting and it turned out it wasn't knitting, but of actual knitting, is a tube of knitting that uses this technique. So the technique is as it's done in the round, and it is a technique that could be done on like a round loom, what some people would call a knitting Nancy. But it could be done on needles as well, and is a technique that has been used in Nordic wire knitting, which you might not call it real wire or real knitting, but it can be seen in that kind of old work too. And what they tended to call it in archeological finds is they would call it compound knitting. Compound meaning you take 2 passes across the stitches in order to actually complete them. And what's happening is that you have a stitch is worked at the same time as a stitch that's created on the next row. So this is the current stitch and this is the previous stitch. And when you work them together, when you work them on a particular row, the previous stitch finally comes off the needle, and then the new loop created with the working yarn is now on the needle with the current stitch. You have 2 loops of yarn on the needle for each column of stitches. And so they were calling this compound knitting. And so they gave me the link to this article, which is very fascinating and has links to other articles, so you can really end up going down a rabbit hole. She referred me to a journal that was published at the end of 2018 that I actually bought it was published right at the time I started getting interested in antique and vintage sweater knitting. And I joined various groups on Ravelry, and they were talking about this. And so I ordered it, and I have the copy. So it's this book here. I'll put a link down in the description. I don't know if there's still copies available. This is a journal that gets published once a year, and this journal was focused on knitting. And because it's something that hadn't really been... terms hadn't been defined, specific terms that could be used in archaeology that would describe knitted textiles in very specific ways, so you could identify how that fabric was constructed. Not necessarily how the person actually knit it, because you can't always know that, but what the construction of the fabric is. And so they proposed all of these different terms. So like with regular, say, stockinette stitch, they would call that simple knitting. And you're going across all of the stitches, and the stitches on the left needle will come off and create that row of stitches. So it's called single course because you go across all of the stitches one time in order to create them. But this type of knitting that this Distitch is, which they had previously called compound knitting, they decided instead that the stockinette version would be called two-course simple knit. So it's at the basic stockinette stitch, but done it's completed by going across all of the stitches twice to complete each stitch. Turns out that her new knitting concept, in terms of the simplest version of it, when it's done in the round, is what we have in some of the very oldest knitting, but she hadn't been able to find it anywhere. And then she not only figured it out on her own, she expanded it greatly. So what she has done in here is figured out how to create these compound stitches or two-course simple knit stitches, how to do that, and then so she's figured out how to cast on, how to bind off, how to do increases, decreases, how to do this in brioche, how to do short rows, how to identify your mistakes, how to tink these stitches, and which is tricky if you've got two loops and they're from two different previous rows. It's tricky. How to fix a mistake on an earlier row. She's got patterns in here. There's hats, there's scarves, there's little coasters. She's got a variety of ways that these stitches can be used. She establishes at the beginning of this book what Distitch is, and she calls it Distitch. It's spelled this way because there's a term in poetry called distich, which refers to, I believe it's like a two-line poem type of thing. So it refers to like a two lines or two rows, but Distitch instead of stick. So it's a really nice name for it. So she lays all of the groundwork for what the structure of this is, and then she explains how to do this. And what's really nice is that she shows you multiple ways, especially for the very first basic knit stitch. She gives you three kind of approaches so you can kind of gradually learn what's going on, and so you can learn to identify what's actually on your needles and which of these two strands of yarn is the new stitch and which is the current stitch and which is the previous stitch that was created on a row earlier. I think it's really interesting. I don't know that it's something that I am going to pursue deeply, but it was very interesting to see what it was and to see this connection back to some of the most ancient knitting that there is. And so clearly our ancestors found this construction to be valuable. Now, what I think her name is Assia. She says there's 4 advantages to this, and that's decorative, which is true of most knitting techniques. We choose to do them because we like their decorative, the decorative nature of them and what sorts of decorative results they produce. Warmth. So again, there are many techniques that create a warmer fabric than the single strand of yarn that you use to knit with it would normally produce, like cables condense the fabric, draw the fabric in, so you need more stitches. to get something that's the same width, and because you need more stitches, you need more yarn, which means it's warmer. Stranded color work and twined knitting are ways of using 2 strands of yarn on every row as you're taking one pass at them, and you're creating a double layer of fabric. Double knitting is also another way of creating a warmer fabric. So there are a lot of different ways that knitters have come up with creating a warmer fabric and doubling up the yarn in some way. So this is another way of doubling up the yarn, but it's a completely different technique. So what I'm going to do now is do a little overhead demonstration on the swatch that I did. This is a very first swatch that I knit on this. I've made some mistakes in it. It's not perfect. And what you'll find is that as I'm demonstrating, when I was working the swatch, I was doing it using my continental method of knitting. It seemed like it made the most sense. But I wanted to show in the demonstration that you could also do this with the yarn in your right hand. And what I discovered for myself in these very early stages of learning this technique, it was easier for me to do that. It was easier to work the stitches the way that those 2 strands of yarn are crossed over each other, and the way you have to kind of separate them as you're working them. And it created slightly looser stitches that made them easier to move along the needle. If I was going to dig further into this, I would really investigate using my right hand style of knitting rather than holding the yarn in my left hand. That doesn't mean that that would be true for everyone. And it doesn't mean that you should do that. It's just I noticed, it's really worth trying it with both hands to see how the technique plays out when the yarn is in a different hand. So this is the book. I don't know how to pronounce her name. She, I believe, is Russian. And so I don't know if that's Assia. I don't know. I'm going to say Assia Brill. Now this is my first attempt, so I made a few mistakes over here while I got used to what the stitches look like on the needles and how to tell them apart. Because what you'll see is that there are 2 sets of stitches on the needle representing each column. And you'll see that at this edge I have a very tight selvage, and over here things are a little bit sloppy. So this stockinette version of the Distitch is what everything else is based on. And I'll show you the basics of how this is actually worked in just a minute. So in the beginning of the book, she shows all the different uses for it, and she talks about that it can be used to be more durable. It's a denser fabric. It's going to be warmer, but you can also use it for decorative effects. You can do some surface types of things with it. There are brioche versions of this. She's using it for some various types of decorative purposes. And then she goes into the vocabulary and how things are structured, and then how to do it. And she's got multiple chapters, and there are projects in these chapters that can really teach you how to use this in various different ways. So these stitches are crossed, and if you look closely, you can see that this stitch right here that's on the left is attached to this running thread here. That means this is the current stitch on the left, and the one on the right is what they call the previous stitch. She shows 3 different ways of working these. They all give you the same result, but it just depends on if you need a way to break down the steps until you really understand what you're doing. She has a long method, a medium method, and then a quick method. And so the quick method is the one I'm going to show you here, where you insert your needle between the 2 stitches. The one that I've grabbed out here is what's called the current stitch. It's the stitch that was most recently created. I'm going to hold onto it with my thumb, and then I'm going to actually go through the previous stitch. I'm grabbing the yarn and I'm bringing it back through both of those loops. So again, you want the current stitch to be on the left, and so you insert your needle between those 2 to kind of pull this one out of the way so that you can go through both of them in order to grab the yarn. You could do this with the yarn in your right hand. So again, I have the yarn in my right hand, so I'm going to come through to grab it like this in order to enter both stitches. I could just wrap it like a regular yarn, and then I'm going to pull it back through both of those stitches like that. So that's another way to do it. If you pull this apart, you could go just directly into that stitch, wrap it, but as you pull it back through, you need to grab the one on the left as well to keep that one on the needle. I actually think that's a little easier to do knitting in the right with the yarn in the right hand. Interesting. I find it much easier to do that, and it's also looser. So for purl, you enter both stitches. And then you take the current stitch, not the previous, the current stitch, which is closest to the tip, and you put it on the left hand or right hand needle. So again, you go through both stitches and you purl them like a purl two together, but you don't let them off the needle, and instead you enter that first one like that. These stitches are always crossed, and you'll notice that when you are working them, they sort of uncross, and that puts the one on the right is the current stitch, and then you can catch it. Last week on my Roaring 20s sweater, I had all the little colored squares that I needed to knit to create the neckline of, or the collar of my Roaring 20s sweater. And I kind of ran into some problems that I will show you. So I'm taking a little bit of a time out from it this week, but I anticipate that I'll be getting back to it in a few days. But I want to show you kind of what I've done so far with it, and then where I am right now. So last weekend I chained all of the little squares together for the neckline. You just single crochet across all of them, and then you chain two stitches, and then you single crochet across the top, chain two, and all the way around. So now I'm at the point where I need to do the outline part of the square. So you're supposed to go around all of these squares with black, and I had to turn an inside corner, so I was working out the best way to turn this inside corner. The outside corner, when you get to the corner stitch, you single crochet 3 times into the corner so that you can turn the corner at a 90-degree rather than causing it to angle. So you need to add stitches as you go around outside corner. So I wasn't finding anything about going around an inside corner, but after I do this row of black, I'm going to have to go around with this kind of beige color all the way around to do the second row. So at that point, you know, this is going to get crowded. So I was trying to work out what I wanted to do in these corners. I was experimenting with a couple of different things. So one of the challenges with this is I don't just have a ball of this black that I can crochet from. I have to split the yarn that I was using to knit the sweater into 2 halves to create a thinner yarn, and that's what I'm crocheting with. So here's the regular yarn. This is the worsted weight yarn that I was crocheting with, and so in order to get that I was knitting with, but for the crochet, I need half that much. So I need to divide the 4 plies into 2 plies. And if you've ever tried doing this, you can see that it gets the twist gets pushed down further into the yarn as you pull these two apart. And now you can see it's grabbed onto something there. Okay. With a small amount of yarn, I can just split it like that. And then what you have to do is let it relax and let it get its twist. The two remaining plies need to twist back around each other to create the 2-ply yarn that you need. Well, there's a challenge. The longer the 4-ply piece of yarn you have is, the more twist you're going to get pushed down into the place where the two are splitting apart. So I was using my spinning wheel to take the twist out of the yarn so that I could more easily split it. But then there's a limit to how long that can be, so that I can let it dangle in some way and get its twist back in. So I can do about 6 to 8 yards, and I can hang over the balcony upstairs and dangle it down into the living room. We have a balcony that looks down into the living room, and I can let it dangle that way, but I can really only do about 6 to 8 yards of that. So I have to, split more yarn. I've run out of the black, but in the meantime, I was experimenting with going around the second row. Did I want to do it from the right side as I had done the black, or did I want to do it from the back side, the wrong side, which would look better? And I was trying different things, and I really wasn't happy with either one. If you can see on the side, this kind of looks a little toothy where the black yarns are. So it looks better on this side, not so great on that side. This was, of course, the first square where I was doing this, so I was learning my technique, and this will be at the back of the neck, so I'm not too concerned about it showing. But what I was noticing is that when I do a row of the beige around here, the black nearly disappears. Pretty much all you see are the little teeth. And I was comparing that to the project photo, which is a black and white photo that's been colorized, and I couldn't really tell if I was getting the correct effect or not. So then I ended up pulling all of the beige out and trying to figure out what to do, and I needed to create some more black yarn for crocheting, and it just got put to the side, and I was a little discouraged. So at this point, I've got everything chained together, but I've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, not quite half of them outlined in black. So I'll get back to it later this week, but I was a little discouraged. Ultimately, my frustration really has to do with being an inexperienced crocheter and knowing what to actually expect in the finished outcome. All I have to go on is the pattern photograph, which was originally in black and white, and it was colorized for the pamphlet, and I can't tell if the artist just drew in some black lines that cause it to look different than it would have actually looked in real life. So I'm seeing a mismatch between what I'm getting and what I'm seeing in the photograph, and I'm just not sure if that's an artistic license or if I'm actually doing something wrong. So I'll find out eventually. One of the challenges of that Roaring Twenties sweater at the beginning was understanding what the wool was, the yarn was that it was called for. And it was a yarn called Shetland floss, which turned out to be a fingering weight yarn that was held double for the sweater, and you would use one of the strands for the crocheted bits. So that's why I had to split the worsted weight yarn into 2 in order to create a yarn that was suitable for the crochet. So one of the pieces of information in the puzzle that I've been trying to solve is how Shetland floss might have been different from the Shetland wool that we can get today. And I've contacted various people in Shetland trying to find out, and either have gotten no answer or gotten answers of we don't know either. So it's really interesting because Shetland floss was something that every yarn producer seemed to have had here in the US all the way up to about 1960. It was incredibly popular yarn. I did buy some vintage Shetland floss that was produced probably in the 1940s, and it's like nothing I'd seen before. So I wanted to order some Shetland wool from Shetland and then compare the difference because I've never knit with Shetland wool before. I don't do a lot of stranded color work, and when I do, I tend to use just regular old wool. And I've heard Shetland wool is really great, but I just had never knit with it. So I thought, well, now's the time to learn that. One of the things that I've been exploring the past couple of years is knitting with wools that are from other breeds than you typically find in most just standard yarn. So I was just going to order a couple of balls of yarn from them, and they had this kit for a hat, and it was to promote Shetland Wool Week last year, and which is kind of interesting because that was going to be the topic of this month's guild meeting was Shetland Wool Week. We were going to have a couple of guild members talking about it, but of course our guild meeting was canceled on Tuesday, so we didn't hear about it. And as I was reading a little bit about Shetland Wool Week after getting this pattern, it was a free pattern, but I bought the kit for the yarn from Jamieson and Smith. I was reading about it. It sounds like a fascinating period of time in Shetland. Shetland's a bunch of different little tiny islands all over the place. And so they have this whole week that's dedicated to Shetland wool, and they have classes on all the different islands and all the different little towns. And some of them are knitting classes, and then there's dyeing, and there's weaving, and there's tours of the factories that create the yarns, and sounds fascinating. It's like, I want to go see that. You have to figure out how you're going to transport yourself from one island to another and where you're going to stay. And so it sounds like it could be a really fun adventure to do something like that. So it's on my bucket list now of things that I would like to do. If not this year, then perhaps next year I'd like to go do that. So I bought this kit. It came in the mail and it was just sitting there. And so when I put my Roaring 20s sweater to the side and I finally found my slow TV Norwegian National Knitting Night TV program to put on, I started the Roadside Beanie. So this is my yarn and my Roadside Beanie that is in progress. So the Roadside Beanie came originally in 4 different colorways. And the colorways, each colorway used yarns from a different Shetland wool producer. So the first colorway was one where they used yarns from Jamieson and Smith, the second one from Fowler wool, the third from Jamieson's of Shetland, which is different from Jamieson's and Smith, or Jamieson and Smith, and then Uredale. I liked colorway number 4, but I was on the Jamieson and Smith website looking to buy yarn when I discovered they had kits for all 4 colorways, but in their yarns. So the yarns that were originally called for and the Uredale yarns are not exactly what Jamieson and Smith has. They're very close, but they're not exactly the same. So then the second challenge is that they had one chart in color using 7 different colors. They only have one chart regardless of what colorway you're using, and with a black and white printer, there were some of the charts I couldn't even tell that there were 2 colors and what the colors were. So I was making notes on them, and it was really kind of hard and a pain. And the charts are in different places. It's just easier for me if I can have it all charted in one place. So I recharted everything, and because it's a Shetland pattern, there's only 2 colors in any given row. And so what I did was I charted it out, and so like you can see for these 2 rows, I'm only using color A. And then when I get to a place where I'm using both colors, I said C was the first color that you see in that row, and then A. And so continue to use C for just these 2, and then the dot is F in this case, and C is the background color. So this dot right here is actually the same color as this open square here, but it's a different, I've divided it, it's a different chart. So again, you can see that F, this is the first color, and then C is the squares, and I do that all the way up until this row, and then you have F, and then the background color changes to G. So I did this, and they all have different repeats. This is a 28 stitch repeat, this is a 4 stitch repeat. And so this line right here tells me what the repeat actually is, but I can see how it's laid out in a bigger scope. And then I get up to this one and I can see that this is the repeat, and this is just no stitch right here. So I was able to chart them out in this way. I can tell exactly what colors I'm supposed to use on a given row, and that makes it a lot easier. The chart's bigger, it's all in one place, and I can figure out what I'm doing. So this starts out with ribbing, and with plain ribbing in this blue color, and then it shifts to corrugated ribbing. And so with corrugated ribbing, you have one color for the knits and then another color for the purls. Oftentimes, the main color, like this blue one, would be the one that would be continuing in the knits, and then the new colors that get introduced might be in the purl columns. In this particular pattern, it does the reverse. It keeps this background color as the purl columns. Corrugated ribbing does not behave the same way that regular ribbing does. You'll see that it's just open and flat. First of all, it's not contracting the way you would ribbing normally would, and because it's stranded color work, it doesn't stretch that as much either. So it looks different. And the main difference is that everything is kind of on the surface. The purls are on the same surface as the knits, and that just looks weird if you're not used to it, because normally in columns the purls would recede like in normal ribbing, but in garter stitch a row of purls would come forward on the fabric, and this isn't doing either one, and it just looks strange at first if you're not used to it. I think I've only done corrugated ribbing one other time, and I think it was a knit one purl one, and so it just wasn't as obvious to me, and maybe the background color was a lot darker, so that just causes the color to recede on its own, and I maybe didn't notice the surface difference. I've started in on the sheep motif. I'm almost halfway done with the sheep, and what's funny is that I'm actually 30% of the way done with the hat, even though I'm only this far, and that's because the crown will take up so much room at the top, and yet it's decreasing the whole time. I don't know for sure that this is going to fit me well. I did some gauge swatching, and then I just got to the point where I'm like, I'm not knitting this necessarily because I want to wear it. I'm knitting it because I want to be knitting it. And so if nothing else, I'm learning something about Shetland wool. It has that kind of hairy appearance to it, and I've always assumed that it would be itchy. Like it would be like most wools are, and kind of itchy. And especially around my neck, if I put this up against my neck, it doesn't feel itchy. So this is one of the big surprises to me with Shetland wool is that it's actually soft. It's not soft in the same way that merino is soft. It's just different. And it's one of those things I think you have to experience to really understand. I get it now. I really like it. And even though you have to knit it at a really fine gauge, it's such a pleasure to work with. And the qualities of this yarn, they call it sticky, and it's a woolen spun yarn, so it's not a smooth yarn. That's why it kind of looks a little hairy, but like I said, it's not itchy. But it's really great for color work because when it's washed, I haven't washed this yet, so I'm looking forward to it. The stitches will bloom a little bit, and they'll kind of run into each other a little bit more, and it'll have more of a painterly effect. And it will also sort of correct certain maybe differences in stitch size. But I'm actually finding this so much easier to knit with good tension than other stranded color work. And I really wonder if it's because it's Shetland. It's interesting, and we'll see what happens when I get further along with this project. I think the corrugated ribbing, when I was knitting it, I thought, this looks so weird. Am I doing it wrong? Is my tension wrong? What's happening? It doesn't look the way I would expect it to look. And I think it's the same sort of phenomenon that I was experiencing with those crochet things. It's like, I've never seen this before up close. You know, I've never done it myself, so I've never paid attention to what it really looks like. And I kept wondering, is this what it's supposed to look like, or am I doing something wrong? And eventually I figured out, no, that's what it looks like. So that put my mind at ease, and I was able to continue on. So I'm looking forward to working on the hat some more this weekend. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.